Nathalie Mezza-García, and welcome to the Floating Cities Show. Here, you'll learn about the latest floating projects, developments, houses, buildings, neighborhoods, floating city plans, and the regulations, zones, and jurisdictions that enable them all across the world. You'll hear directly from the makers, the architects, designers, developers, engineers, and even the regulators that make floating projects possible. Come join me while together with Sophia, we help you navigate the complexity of these new waters. Hello everyone, I'm here with Leo De Watts from HMD. How are you, Leo?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me on. It's good to have a chat.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to start the day talking to you, even though I had to run to come here. But great. I'm happy to have run.
Yeah.
So, how are you? How are things, Leo, with HMD? Oh, first of all, tell to our listeners and viewers, what's your company? What do you do?
Yeah, sure. So HMD is a group of companies that we bring together as a sort of an ecosystem that allows us to be able to, build a number of sites, buildings, put projects together basically. So we act as sort of the overall project manager, as it were. And then we bring together, a number of different opportunities to make things happen. So, particularly in the UK, we have issues with trying to find land, getting planning permission, and then also putting structures up. Typically also, you have a bit of an issue with the planning authorities. They all want to have buildings in certain areas that are very similar to ones that have been made previously. But those buildings have a terrible environmental footprint. So, we're looking to put in more sustainable architecture, things that have a low impact on the land, and also rewild the land as well, to make the whole project either carbon neutral or carbon negative. So those are the things, the sort of the challenges that we face. And in order to do that, we need to work with lots of different parties in order to make that happen. So, that's what we do, is we sort of always look forward to working with lots of different people, to make these projects happen.
That's how it usually is, especially the more innovative a project, the more parties you have to bring in together. And I do see that your company manages to put together the right partners to execute each project. And so the challenges are high footprint. Your answer is, or your response to this is, a more sustainable approach to construction of homes. So how do you do this?
Yeah, exactly. So to start with, it's a case of sourcing the raw materials initially. First of all, is there anything else that we can make use of that's already there, that's already been made? Do we need to make anything new? And that even goes down to the land that we select. So, for example, if you find a pristine field that's never been touched and you go and build there, then that's probably not a good idea, because there's already an existing habitat.
Yeah.
However, if you go and have a look at what we call in the UK a brownfield site, which is typically a site that's been used for some sort of construction or industry before, and it could do with basically being sort of put back in a more sort of naturally sort of sympathetic way, then we go in and have a look at that and say, can we use potentially some of the services that are already there? So while we can make off-grid buildings, if there is already mains connectivity there, can we utilize that? So what can we reuse on the site to start with? And then we follow that sort of philosophy through every step of the build. So if we have to build anything new, then it's a case of, okay, well, can we get it from sustainable sources? So we work predominantly in wood as well. And we look to say, well, can we get that from sustainable forests? And that's basically our sort of methodology all the way through. Unfortunately, we're in this position now where for a lot of technology, you do need to use, you know, a certain amount of sort of construction or industry in order to make things. But, you know, the way that we're all moving is a case of saying, well, how can we make this more sustainable? So that's, again, why, you know, working with partners is important, because a lot of people are specialists in their particular field. And rather than go and sort of reinvent the wheel, it's a case of just sourcing partners who themselves have got a strong sort of environmental philosophy as well to that approach. So really the other key thing is in construction industry typically has a lot of waste and is basically quite a large environmental polluter. So it's a case of, you know, what can we use that's already there? If it's not already there, what can we use that is sustainable and that will regrow? And then if we do have to make anything new, how do we minimize waste? And anything new that we've got to put in, can we make sure that that can be, you know, refurbished or at a later date, you know, taken apart and used for something else when it comes to the end of life?
I love that approach a lot. What are some of the sites, brown sites, that you find a new use for?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it can be a mixture of things, really. It could be brownfield sites that have actually been derelict for, you know, many years. It could be old quarries, old mines, you know, maybe old sections of old railway stations, disused airfields. You know, particularly places which lend themselves to being built on and also had a certain amount of infrastructure. So, you know, in terms of particularly those things I just mentioned, they will all have, you know, road networks, rail networks, things like that would have gone, you know, somewhere near them in the first instance. So that's also what's quite useful about selecting sites that, you know, have been built on previously, is that a lot of infrastructure already exists. So we don't need to then go and build new roads to get to these locations.
That's awesome. Or build new power stations, which can increase the cost of a project significantly. So that's very smart.
No, cheers, thanks.
Cheers.
Yeah, and also on the energy side, you know, we do try and work with, you know, renewable energy providers if we're going to hook a site up to the grid. Alternatively, you know, if we're using renewable energy from the point of view of can we put in, you know, solar panels, wind turbines, you know, that sort of thing as well. So yeah, so there's a number of different options, you know, to go with energy providers and ways of generating energy on site. But yeah, depending on the needs.
So for queries, I'm going to step back a bit. What are some of the uses that you found for them? Or how do you, what can you do with a query?
No, exactly. Well, a lot of them, you know, it depends on what stage they're at a later date. So, you know, sometimes when materials, again, it depends what sort of quarry it is, because lots of different materials, you know, come out of the ground. It depends if it's then since been sealed up. You know, a lot of the times we think of a quarry as being a big pit, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be more sort of mining through tunnels into the land, and, you know, a lot of the waste product, perhaps waste soil and minerals, have been put on top of the site instead. So when we look at that, we think to ourselves, well, okay, how would we go about, you know, supporting ecology here? What plants and also, you know, naturally occurring, you know, flora has been able to grow up on that site? What animals are visiting that site? That sort of thing. Are they all sort of, you know, healthy and all the rest of it? So, you know, we look at that and go, well, can we build, you know, a low impact building that doesn't require much, you know, foundation, as it were, into the land, and can we help sort of support that site into a thriving environment? So that's for your sort of typical, you know, quarries where you're sort of dealing mainly with tunnels and things like that. If you have a more sort of open quarry, there's a number of them that have been, you know, filled in with water, and that is something that a number of people, particularly in the UK, where they've been making quarries, is considering the option of, well, if that was to fill with water, could you put floating buildings on there? And so that's another route that we've been looking at as a consideration, as we're able to provide floating buildings, amphibious buildings as well. So there are definitely options there when it comes to quarries and different types of quarries and what you can do.
Are some of the floating home projects in quarries already built? Do they already exist, or you're in the process of developing them?
Yeah, we're currently in the process of developing. I believe there's others who've been able to do that already, and there might be a couple of case studies that are worth looking into. But for us, it's very much a case by case basis. But yeah, we're looking at, for the floating home quarries, that would be definitely a good route to go down. We find, again, like in the UK, what has happened is quite a large area of the UK that was zoned as residential. Quite a bit of that has now since been rezoned as floodplain. So it's a case of, well, how do you build on a floodplain? And that's where our amphibious buildings, come into their own, because for most of the time, perhaps for a number of years, they will remain level on the ground. And then the one time you get a flash flood or a river bursts its banks or whatever else might happen, the buildings are able to rise up and basically act as floating homes.
That is so cool.
Yeah, so that's quite another sort of interesting concept to go down. So I think, particularly with, more land being submerged and, not necessarily being submerged all the way throughout the year and not always being submerged every year, something like that does give you a bit of flexibility with where you build.
Yeah. So for those who are listening or watching and don't know what an amphibious building is, can you describe what an amphibious building is and how they differ from floating?
Yeah, sure. So basically with the floating home, that's built on effectively a boat hull. And then you've got the rest of the building above it. For an amphibious building, you do have a hull, but that hull basically goes into a sort of a smaller set of like foundations, as it were, built into the ground. So what happens then is, for the most part, it sort of stays in that foundation that's there. But
like a box.
Yeah, exactly. And then as soon as the water comes in and sort of floods that foundation, then the hull that's there rises up within the foundation, and it's also sort of secured to them, so it doesn't then float outside of that foundation. So yeah, and then when the water goes, it is able to slot back down again, into that area. Whereas with a floating building, it doesn't have any form of foundation underneath it that it sort of matches into. You can tether a floating building to the shore, quite easily using other techniques, but for something that needs to rise and fall and slot back into place again, that's where we have a sort of almost like a sort of a plug and socket system with the amphibious buildings.
That's cool. So what are the types of considerations? What are the things that you have to take into account when designing an amphibious building that you don't have to when deciding a floating building or a building on land?
Yeah, sure. So if you consider a floating building, then you know where you stand, right? You know that your pipe work, things like that, all has, if it's going back onto the shore, if you've got an on-grid house, needs to be flexible, and also you need to know that for the most time, in fact all the time, it's being used as a floating building. So with that in mind, you build things to the extreme. When it comes to a amphibious building, that's very much more of a sort of a compromise, as it were. And you're saying, well, okay, for most of the time, it's got to be used as a normal building. But then, in the event that something, does flood, it then needs to, be able to work, just as it would as a floating home. So there are a number of costs, that are incurred by making a building, able to sort of switch between the two. And effectively, it just means that actually, you've got to have more consideration. You've got to consider how high the, flood water might go. if you are connecting the building up to, the main services. But then that also is really not much different from, a tidal estuary, or putting a building on, the sea, and it rising and falling there, as it would do, potentially for the occasional flood. The other thing to consider is access. So, typically people would walk up to their building on land, but on the occasion that it floods, then, how are people going to get to it then? And what backup do you have? So, you can create walkways that will also float, should floodwaters come in. So in that regard, an amphibious building on the outset could actually sort of cost more than a floating home, because again, it's got to be able to do, both things. Whereas, if you're just building a normal house, you'd build a normal sort of walkway, or cut a path in the grass, or wherever it is that you might site it, to be able to get to it. But yeah, unfortunately, with an amphibious home, then you've got to have you've got to build it as if it's floating, but then put it on the ground. So
yeah.
I think the comparison really is if you weren't building an amphibious building, then you might not be able to build a building there at all. So where people might consider the cost, I think that's the thing. I think people go, okay, well, how much does a normal building cost me? How much does an amphibious building cost me? And how much does a floating building cost me? And the comparison between a amphibious building and a normal building, there could be quite a bit of difference, but between a floating building and an amphibious one, probably comparatively not as much. But then if a normal building is out of the option, then really it's a case of, well, the amphibious one is the one to go for. So yeah, it's always a compromise.
So the process, you would wonder normally, okay, why would someone go for an amphibious building, right? But then as I hear you talking, then I guess what happens is that someone has a plot of land and the land happens to get flooded and they want to build a home. So that's when they start considering these options, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it can also be for other structures. So, while we can talk about amphibious houses, it can also be, any sort of structure that needs to ideally not flood, can be floated. So it sort of mitigates their flood risk there. So, it could be storage, it could be greenhouse, it could be, any number of things that, needs to be kept above water on the site.
So for places, I'm in the US and 10 hours away from here, it's New Orleans. And so is amphibious buildings something that cities like New Orleans that are renowned, unfortunately, for flooding after hurricanes, is that or even an island in the northern Colombia, up from my city, is this type of construction something that cities like these two cities can begin doing for new developments as a way to lower the impact of climate events?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really the key, is when looking at construction techniques, it's a case of, sort of future proofing a lot of these buildings and sort of climate proofing, what we're building. Because if we continue to build in the same way that we have been doing, then again, you have all these, weather events occur and flooding. And it's a case of, well, either do you say to people, actually, you just can't live there? Or do you say, well, actually, we can build differently? So, yeah, certainly this is, one of the things that we've been looking at is for places that are prone to flooding, places that are, prone to extreme weather phenomena, what technique can be used. And even though, our buildings are comparatively small, that we typically make amphibious, we have made 2-story buildings amphibious as well before. So, the actual scale of the building, is not really a problem when it comes to looking at the sort of the way that we can make it float, or make it amphibious. And you might compare that perhaps to, you can make a small dinghy float, but you can make a absolutely massive cruise liner float as well. So there's nothing new there really. It's just the application of taking technology from one area and applying it to buildings.
Why do you think, or let me ask you before doing an assumption, an open question. Have you seen, I have, so maybe I'm kind of biased here, but maybe you are too. But do you think, objectively speaking, that there is an increase in demand in the last years? Have you seen it?
For floating homes?
Yeah, and amphibious?
Yeah, I think this is the thing really. It's interesting because people have got quite a high affinity to water. There's a number of people, who want to live near water, who, want to be able to see water, that sort of thing. And, you always get people who are drawn to, different areas. Some people like to live in the mountains. It's just interesting to see across the world where, a lot of people would prefer or choose to live. And I think what's happened previously is people didn't really have so much of a choice, because if you wanted a job, you had to head towards the city, if you wanted a high paying job, etc. With the notion of saying, well, actually, you can live more remotely if you want. You don't have to, live right in the middle of the city. That gives people the option to choose and go, well, where do I actually want to live then?
Yes.
And with that freedom, I think there's probably just increased traffic, or increased number of people wanting to go and live in the countryside, in the mountains. But also that means that we're going to get an increase in people wanting to live, on lakes, on rivers, and by the sea as well. So because just of that phenomena, and being able to be, if you've got a digital-based job and you can work remotely, then just the nature of that alone, I think, has been an increase.
Yeah.
The other thing as well is, if you can live on waterways, particularly in more sort of crowded areas, that seems to be, one of the options, as it were, to people looking to try and beat the housing crisis. To say, well, actually, could I live on the water instead? And typically, if you are a developer and you want to build in a certain area, then you can either go about reclaiming land, or you could say, well, actually, we're going to build floating buildings instead. So, I think really the preference there would be, if you do have to build out into the water or into the sea, it'd be far better ecologically to promote floating buildings than it would be constantly, reclaim land. And again, it depends where you are in the world as to how much land you've got available, etc. But yeah, I definitely think that given that it's more of an option, given that it's probably more, I don't know if acceptable is necessarily the word, but just given that is now an option, and saying to people, okay, well, where would you rather live? I think it's not really surprising that we see a number of people, wanting to live on the water.
Yeah, because if you think about living in the water in the past, then you think typical houseboat, and then you think, okay, I have to do a lot of maintenance on my houseboat. Maybe I don't want to deal with that, or I don't want my water to dip. But the thing about floating buildings in the way that is available now is that there is more similarity between living in land stably with living in these types of buildings, right? And I couldn't relate more with what you said about, if you have a digital-based job, you just move to wherever you want to, and you want to be close to the ocean and far from things. And you know that I lived in the UK, right, for a few years. And in the last place I lived there was in La Morna. Are you familiar with La Morna?
Yeah.
In Penzance?
Yeah.
It's just beautiful. South of UK, but there's bamboo. There's bamboo trees, and they seem native.
It's very tropical.
Yeah.
Palm trees and things like that.
Yeah. And it was a cove, La Morna Cove, and in the middle of nowhere. Beautiful. The closest supermarket was 20 minutes away in car in Penzance. So it was Yeah, I completely agree with you. There is a trend, not a trend, but the option between the more you can choose where you live, and especially post COVID, no? People
Yeah.
recently do seem to want to get away from their devices and just.
Yeah. I think that's very much it. You know, this reconnection with nature is very important, and you know, whether that's out in the fields, whether that's close to the sea, close to the ocean, that sort of thing. And you know, often I think people end up sort of chasing a salary rather than chasing a lifestyle.
Yes.
And if you say, well, I mean, we see this with companies a lot. You know, it's very difficult to control your revenue. It's very difficult to say, okay, well, we want more money, as a business, so we're going to go out there and get more money. It's a lot easier to look at your costs and say, well, what can I, if I cut down the costs, do I create more of a margin? And that's just a purely sort of, economics based approach to it. So if we apply that to our own lives and we go, okay, well, what am I earning? I'm earning London wages, but why are they London wages, or why are they New York wages? Well, because the cost of living in this town or this city is very high. So you end up chasing your tail, whereby, you're earning a lot, but you're spending a lot.
Yeah.
Ideally, if you can cut your costs, you don't need to earn as much, right?
That's
so, you go and live out in Penzance or somewhere similar, and you go, well, actually, I'm not earning as much, but I'm actually keeping a lot more of the money that I am earning. And particularly, if you have lived in the city, chances are you've probably been trained up, you've probably got a number of skills that you can then, apply and go out on your own and do. Mind you, not everyone wants to run their own business, which is, of course, not a problem. You can always join an agency, or you can always join a company that does allow for remote working. And I think we're seeing more and more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Also platforms like Upwork, Fiverr, all those platforms that allow you to maybe not start your own business, but at least be more in charge of your own time management and deliverables.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's it, because also if, for example, you like doing, being out by the water, going for walks, doing sort of water-based sport, whatever it might be, if you're living where you want to be, you've got sort of zero commute to work if you want to work from home, or a lot of places are setting up more sort of rural hubs now. If you still feel that need to, you need to separate yourself from your living side of things and go into work, you can. I mean, again, post-COVID, we'll see how it goes in terms of shared office space and things like that again. But anyway, these sort of more rural working hubs. But at the same time, you've got sort of, zero commute, as it were, to get outdoors and go and do the things that you want to do and actually, spend your life living, as it were, rather than spending your life working.
Yeah, like the typical phrase, working to live as opposed to living to work as opposed to working to live, right? Yeah.
No, exactly. And
so that brings me to one of your projects. I don't know if we can talk about it. Let me know. If not, I'll cut it. I think we can talk about it because I saw it on your website and I think it's extremely cool. Talk about a Navajo.
Yeah, sure. So, So basically the problem you've got, again, with particularly the UK, but I know it does apply to other places in the world, is this notion of going and, buying your own site, putting a building on it, and being able to do that is kind of out of the reach of a lot of people. And it's this idea that would be nice to be able to do, but it's very difficult to achieve. So what we're doing with Navajo is we're developing sites. So, we find a site, again, as I mentioned before, one that is, perhaps could do with rewilding, could do with restoring the habitat there, etc. We look at the site, we landscape it, we rewild it, we plant wildflowers. We have a whole team dedicated to that. And then from there, we build houses, put those on the site as well. Now, in terms of those houses, it's a case of either selling them to people, to residents, or renting them to them. Now, those houses, again, can be a number of different things. It just depends on, how we've set up the site. But, if there is a lake on the site, it can be floating houses. There can be houses that are just, put around the landscape, but they're done sympathetically. So they sort of, they don't really have any borders between, one house and the next, but you have these burrows and sort of hills and things like that around the landscape to sort of create divides between each person's house. You have, central sort of communal areas, but at the same time, you can have your own privacy on that site as well. If you are, you want a tiny house, like a tiny house on wheels, we have areas on the site for that as well. Off-site parking with solar panels. We have the ability for people to recharge, their electric vehicles, things like that. So the other thing is on the site is we look at mixed use, and the main thing is balancing economy with ecology. So
nice.
At the time, we've got this issue where we need to house people, but also, people need to have jobs and need to be able to generate an income. And a bit like what I mentioned before about having, a hub, as it were, a rural hub where people can go and, use sort of co-working space. It's a case of what sort of communal spaces can we put on a site so that people can use that. But also other people visiting, the area, a bit like just any village. Like, would you visit the village shop? Would you, what other services, restaurants, things like that would a village have? How can we incorporate that into what we're doing on the Navajo site, and just basically set it up as an eco village where you can live there knowing, that you're living sort of ecologically responsibly, as it were. And also, really the key to it is to make the houses affordable, and also make them affordable to run as well. So where possible, solar panels, renewable energy, wind turbines, that sort of thing. If they have to be hybrid buildings, because, sometimes at the moment with regards to energy storage, it can be a bit of an issue, but, can it have connection to the grid for times of high demand? And I think really, where we're going with the environment and our, responsibility and sort of changing this big ship that we have, of ways of doing things in the past is if we do have to, set up new villages, if we do have to provide more housing, how can we make sure that going forward we do it in a sustainable way? And really from that point of view, in order to be sustainable, it needs to be financially sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable, because otherwise you end up sort of creating a charity or something similar where they all have their place. But in order to be scalable, it has to be attractive to investors and other entities as well, because otherwise it just won't catch on. And that's the thing that we're really keen to do, is to make something that's very attractive, also to welcome in competition to the market as well, to make similar sorts of villages. And again, it'll be a case of who can make it as ecologically responsible as possible. And that will, I think, be part of the race going forward, for housing for developers, etc. So we've got our blueprint, as it were, of what we think these sites should be, and that's what we're working on at the moment. But I think particularly at the moment with a lot of sort of mental health issues surrounding the environment, surrounding I think people's place in the world, and this sort of feeling of, well, what can I do to live sort of more responsibly? It's a case of providing these types of sites is potentially one of the answers to that question. So I think it's quite an exciting project, and really pleased and excited to be part of it. So it's just one of these things where it does take time to create, but it's like all these things, once you've got a proven model that works, it then becomes scalable, and a lot of people want to get involved with it. So that's really sort of the exciting thing for me, is to, see this project grow and increase. But, as I said to you at the very beginning, it requires working with lots of different parties in order to do it, and lots of stakeholders. And that's the exciting thing, is being able to work with lots of different people who've got different opinions and bring in different skills, and, helping to be able to grow this thing a lot quicker. Because if we just did it ourselves, then it would, take our entire lifetimes to do.
Yeah, it takes. Yeah, I completely understand. Yeah, yeah. And I'm seeing here. I see here, because I have a screen here, one of the proven models. I'm looking at your office, and as you were talking about this new, I don't want to say the tendency. Yeah, tendency. How cool would it be to work from it?
Yeah, I think that's really the key. We've set up our headquarters.
Oh, that's your office.
Yeah, well, it depends which one you might be looking at, but
the eco floating office at night.
Oh, okay. No, so that one was one that was done for a client before. But yeah, no, this thing is, this enjoyment of where you work. And I mean, for me, I've always found in the past that as long as I can, it's a bit like, I guess, being people who work in a coffee shop, and again, a bit like the co-working space. You work where you feel like you're not necessarily working completely by your own. And I think if you're able to work with, big windows, and you're able to look out, you feel like, you're not missing out. Whereas when you are sort of working, by yourself at home, I feel like sometimes you get the whole sort of, fear of missing out thing, sensation.
Yeah.
Whereas when you feel like, you can watch sort of nature go past and all the rest of it, okay, you might be having to, like, all of us do have to work at some point.
At some point, more than at some point.
Well, I know, but at least you have, feel like you are sort of out there with nature. I think that has its own sort of calming effect and its own sense of happiness as well, to it. And part of what we're trying to do with the Navajo village is, particularly for the working areas, is creating areas where it's a case of, okay, well, we're going to move to, that meeting room over there, or how do you get to it? Oh, you just follow the path along, and it's by that, big tree over there, and then just go down there, and you'll get to it, rather than saying, oh, we're in, meeting room B, and you go along that corridor, and you're, in there.
I love that.
Walking through, the woods or over a hill or something like that to get to your next meeting.
I love that. Last year, at some point, I went with my family to a very, very rural area in the north of Colombia. We were going to some caves. Yeah, it was some caves, and there were some boys from the area, from this rural area, playing there, and we asked them, hey, where do we go? Because we were in the town, but it was outside of the town. And he said, okay, go straight. Go to the tree of, I don't remember what fruit he said, but I didn't know how that tree looked. Go to that tree, then turn left, then you'll find some, like a rock or something, and then you go down. But it was my mom and I were thinking, that's how directions used to be given in the past. And I like it because it is more raw.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other thing is, particularly as our civilization has progressed, we've distanced ourselves a lot from nature.
Yeah.
And, if you were to say, well, what tree is that? What plant is that? What is that? What's its properties? What does it do? Unfortunately, through no fault.
Say that as I have a fake plant on my desk.
Well, this is the thing. It's interesting because, we always want things sort of neat and tidy, and we're quite clinical, really, as how we've progressed. And we're quite, far removed for the most part, particularly, I don't know, 20 years ago, was social media manager a job, for example? It probably, I don't know, actually, 20 years ago, it probably didn't really exist. And before that, web designer and things like that. All of our jobs now, particularly if you look at sort of the majority of the workforce, I would say, are using computers. There's very little or comparatively little outdoor work that goes on compared to the number of jobs that require a computer. Of course, there is still a lot of outdoor jobs, but then a lot of automation, has come in as well. And I just think that it's interesting because I think we always search for something quite tactile. And this is something I've noticed when I was growing up. For example, we used, biro pen. You could click them.
Yes.
You'd have like a four-way biro, and you click that and you spin it. And then what's happened, a number of years ago, you'd have like fidget spinners, or you'd have fidget cubes, right?
Yes.
And because everyone's using, laptops and things like that in classes, right? So you're starting to miss out on these tactile things that are sort of, I guess, deeper psyche, as it were, wants to go and find, and this sense of adventure. And it's no longer really part of our life. It's always something that's removed. You always have to go out to nature. You can't just sort of live amongst it. And it's sort of also seen as, well, either you're sort of a complete digital nomad, or not digital nomad, you're a complete nomad and you're off the grid and you're one of those weird people who, lives in nature, or you're the opposite and you're you live in the city, you live in a town, and, going out to go and do something outdoorsy is a bit of a novelty, really. You do it occasionally.
It's a thing.
So I think just there needs a little bit of balance, readdressing. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is find a solution which leans things back a bit more towards a more sort of rural setting. But it's, once you develop technology, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? Yeah. It's there, it exists. So it's like, well, how do we now take the good things that we have done, through advancing in civilization, and then how do we refine that to bring back in, some of the things that we're missing and some of the balance. And I just think that's just a constant thing that we have to look and redress. But that's where I think construction, particularly of new houses and new buildings, I think needs to do more to, rather than just provide and produce, more villages, more cities. It's a case of saying, well, actually, we've done all that. Can we now do something that, do we always have to put down lots of concrete or lots of tarmac everywhere? Can we go back a bit, or not necessarily back, but can we go forwards with what we know now?
I like that. Going forward. Yeah. And that is one reason why your Eco Pavilion at Arlington Park has been praised, no? Because of the experience it gives to people who go there for events.
Yeah.
So I imagine that, but living in a floating home in the middle of nature that still has all your plugs for connecting your phone and your laptop, it does increase your life quality.
Yeah.
Because it gives you that more choice.
Yeah.
That what we were talking earlier about how houses are we have more choices now. And it's also good to have them not only at the level of the development, but also at the level of the individual. Okay, I can plug my computer here and work from home, but I can also walk 190 steps and go to my office and plug it and work there, which is a nice co-working, by the way. So I completely relate with what you are saying.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think the other thing to do, to consider is, not everyone also wants to live very remotely or things like that. They still want this sense of community. And also particularly for, recent school leavers, recent graduates, the whole notion of going to the city and also, the excitement of that, will continue to exist, I'm sure. It's just a case of saying, well, what about first-time buyers? What about people who've done the city life and now want, a change and that sort of thing? So, it's one of these things, again, it's all about balance and different stages of life for people. And this thing that you're saying where, you're still connected, as it were, to people and to what you need to do. And that's where I think, again, as I said before, about sort of trying to move forwards, it's a case of, again, we're always compromising, aren't we? It's a case of, okay, you can live in a city, but you've got to say goodbye to nature, or okay, you can live in nature, but you've got to say goodbye to a sense of community and things like this. And I think, over time, we'll work out the balance. And that's sort of the good things of technology, I suppose, is, again, previously you really were bound by where you needed to work as where you had to live. Whereas, this is a step forward, I think, for everyone, is the advancement of technology. It's just a case of, again, as a compromise with the advancement of technology, we've also increased our, pollution and problems as well. So now we just have to try and fix those. So, it's a bit of a never-ending cycle with that. But, I think this constant ability to review where we've got to, and then address the problems and then continue to move forward is probably a good outlook to have.
That would be a perfect line to end the show, but I really want to ask you about the floating pavilion. So what is this super beautiful building? Where is it? What is it used for?
Yeah, sure. So it's in Arlington Business Park, and basically it was developed, as a meeting room there. So it was actually done for a client, and so we just have it on the website to showcase what we're able to do. And the design brief really was to be able to have a building that was built without any apparent attachment, to the land, or any sort of like big supporting cables or things like that, or without having to, build up from, underwater and create the pavilion that way. So, that was part of it. So it was up against a number of other designs, and then this one won through. But I think it's a good example of how you can have an office space, in the middle of a lake or in nature, as it were. And the whole point of the buildings really is, although it looks, quite nice from the inside, looking into the building and looking at the building, a lot of the design concept comes from how does that building make you feel? And when you're inside the building, what do you see from it? And I think with a lot of architecture, a lot of the focus is on what does the building look like from outside.
Yes.
But not as much emphasis is probably spent on, well, okay, let's say you're in the building, what are your views like? And particularly you always see sort of the 3D models of looking into a building, but, what are the views out of the window? And so really that's something that's probably not captured so well, on a website or a photo of the building or anything like that. Perhaps maybe a 3D camera in there, with being able to, move it around would probably give a better idea, or visiting it, the building itself. But yeah, so we have done a number of offices, not dissimilar to that, which are used for a whole number of different things. It depends what the client, needs them for. But they definitely have got a massive wow factor to them, because they're very unique, and there aren't really many examples of them compared to just a normal, sales office or a normal meeting room or anything else like that. So, yeah.
I can imagine board meetings here. They must be very peaceful.
Yeah.
All decisions get
or distracting. Or distracting.
Yeah, but in a good way.
Yeah. No,
it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Floor to ceiling windows. I love it.
Yeah. So, that's something we try and factor into a lot of our designs, even if it's a land-based building. Large floor to ceiling windows, sliding windows, sliding doors, all sorts of things that you see in that design, we try and sort of bring through into the land-based ones as well.
I love it. And the tone of the ceiling, it resembles the wood color. That's intentional, I assume.
Yeah, it's the attention to detail on these buildings is, really high level. And, everything is picked out, and it's a case of thinking, okay, well, what are people, first, what does the client want the building for? How does that reflect what they want to achieve and what they want as a brand. You know, and that's the same thing that's reflected through in the work that's done for, you know, residential buildings as well. You know, where is this building going to go? How is it in keeping with, you know, local existing architecture? And, you know, at the beginning of our call, I mentioned about, you know, getting planning permission, and it's got to fit in keeping with, you know, sort of traditional houses.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is the thing, it's a case of, well, how do we build something that people don't necessarily lose the identity of, you know, that area, and the human identity of that area. But then how do we match that in to fit in with the, you know, the eco, or the ecology of that area as well. So, you know, it really just depends on the client, on the location, what the building's being used for. And then, you know, a lot of the things in there, for example, are upcycled where possible, or recycled.
Oh.
So, you know, it'll be the case of, you know, you might have, you know, wooden paneling, you might have some beams, you might have furniture in there that's, you know, from mid-century or has been used on other buildings previously.
Oh,
It
like,
gets sourced and used where possible.
I think I know which wood panels you mean and which upcycled mid-century chairs maybe you're referring to. Are they in the floating home and hotel suite that is in front of the yellow building?
Yeah. So a number of the floating homes, yeah, they all have, you know, things that have been sourced from different areas, particularly in the UK. But yeah, again, predominantly sort of 1950s sort of era. But again, with the wood that you'll find, you know, on the walls as well, or as a
Nice.
you know, kitchen surface or something like that, you know, they have been taken and repurposed from, you know, other projects as well. So again, if we can avoid cutting anything down or having to get anything made, you know, we will try where possible to do that. So that's a big part of our ethos.
I love that. Great way also to make the project more attractive from the financial point of view for the developer.
Yeah.
In some cases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's the other thing, is that it means the building can tell a story as well. So, you know, you're there, but it's not just sort of okay, well, you know, everyone can buy this particular building. There's always some sort of you know, difference to them, as it were, and something sort of unique about them as well. So yeah, that's a big part of it.
Yes, I can see that as I look at another. Is this your office, the floating hub?
That one. So the office that we currently use is actually a different one, which is all land-based, but that'll probably be an office for, I'm not too sure which one you're looking at, but that'll be another office for, another client, I'm sure.
Beautiful. I'm looking at the one in St. Catherine Dock.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that one. Yeah, no, that's, that's going, I mean, anyone who's in St. Catherine's Dock can go down and have a look at it. Unfortunately, I think in terms of going and having a tour around it, I need to liaise with the client to see if that would be possible. But you know, that's a really beautiful building, and it's quite popular dock as well. So I think that one gets used quite a lot as well for meetings, and I think that one is mainly a sales office at the moment.
That's cool.
Yeah. But it's quite interesting because, like, height wise as well, you'd think there'd be a height restriction on putting a building in a dock, but because again it's tidal, then you know the building only protrudes from the top of the dock area for part of the day and then goes back down again as well. So you know, being able to put a floating building in, for example, in the middle of London, pretty much, even though it might have its sort of technical constraints, we've managed to find a way to do that. You know, that's actually comparatively sort of straightforward, you know, depending on what permissions and things need to be gained to do it. But again, with being able to make off-grid buildings as well, that means, you know, we can put buildings where, you know, there are no services, as it were, which gives, you know, a client a huge amount of flexibility as to where they want to position their building.
And that allows people to be more far if they want to.
Yeah, exactly. Or actually even closer, because, you know, in order to bring services to, you know, the side of a bank or whatever it might be, you'd need to typically go and dig up potentially, you know, part of a road, or, you know, you need to go and bring services through someone's field or whatever it might be, to do it. And that's quite a lot of cost as well. Whereas if you can be, completely off grid, then actually you don't have to worry about all of those services or, having to go and try and talk to however many of your neighbors about trying to bring services in. So, that does give you that massive benefit as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Leo, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been great. I can't wait for this to be edited, to have a bunch of images of everything we were talking about. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much as well. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Cheers.